Old man, that cheap-looking badge. Where'd you get it? A toy store? Brent hurled the words across the counter like a slap to the face. A few young customers burst into laughter, folding their arms as they watched the scene unfold, like cheap entertainment. Veteran Leland Ward stood there, his back slightly bent with age, but his eyes steady as stone. He didn't respond. His silence only made Brent's voice grow louder. So you actually came in here looking for parts for that antique of yours? Your time is over. People who keep up with the modern world are the ones who matter now. Another round of laughter followed, along with murmurs of mockery. The air thickened with contempt, all directed at a man who had lived long enough to outgrow the sting of petty insults. Leland remained still, his hands resting gently on the counter. Brent, irritated by that calmness, kept piling on the cruelty. Are you even sure you're still sane enough to pass a background check? Or should I call a nursing home to come pick you up? The crowd roared again. Just when Brent thought he had won, Leland spoke for the first time, his voice low and firm, simple, yet heavy enough to slow the entire room. I just want to buy a part. That's all. The short sentence only made Brent angrier. He grabbed the worn collar of Leland's old coat to shove him away, but his fingertips brushed against a small silver badge hidden beneath the frayed fabric. In that instant, Leland froze. A cold breath. A muffled echo from a distant battlefield. The image of a young soldier collapsing into the ice. And then it faded as he gently pulled his coat back into place. Leland looked straight at Brent. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough depth to silence every sound around them. There are things whose worth doesn't need to be shown for you to understand. Silence fell. No one laughed anymore. And at that exact moment, from the parking lot outside, a deep, steady rumble began to rise. A sound that did not belong to the noisy chaos of a shopping center, but to a force drawing closer with unmistakable purpose. If you believe true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the quiet strength of those who have lived through war, subscribe to brave veteran stories, and help us preserve the memories, dignity, and honor of America's quiet heroes. Leland stepped out of the store and sat down on the concrete bench beside the parking lot. He breathed slowly, each breath held tight, as if trying to steady his heart after the storm that had just crashed over him. The space around him was far quieter than the chaotic noise behind the door that had just shut. Only the sound of wind sweeping past the rows of parked cars, the distant hum of the highway, and the faint tremble in the old man's breath, a chest that had endured more years than anyone there could imagine. His hand rested on his knee veins, rising beneath sun-worn skin. Those hands had once carried ammo, pulled wounded men to safety, held a rifle through nights cold enough to crack bone. Now they simply closed gently, as though afraid to drop the small keepsake tucked inside his coat pocket. Leland unbuttoned his jacket and took out the tarnished silver badge. Its dull sheen no longer gleamed like it did in his youth, but to him its worth had never dimmed. He rolled it lightly between his fingers. The cold metal seeped through his skin, pulling up a memory he did not resist. A shard of memory flared, ice covering the ground in a solid white sheet, artillery rumbling from the mountainside, the hoarse voices of comrades calling out to each other in 20 below zero wind. A young hand had once grabbed his in its final moments, a short sentence swallowed by the freezing air. Then silence closed over that memory, the same way it had for decades. Leland blinked and returned to the present. The parking lot lay in front of him, empty, yet strangely peaceful. Light footsteps echoed across the concrete. Corporal Reed stopped a few steps away, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Are you all right, sir?" The way he said "sir" made Leland's lips lift slightly, not out of amusement, but out of a quiet respect that the younger generation sometimes understood better than the loud-mouthed people inside the store. He didn't answer with words. He just gave a small nod. No complaint. No bitterness. As if what had just happened hadn't left a single scratch on the dignity forged by a lifetime of war. Reed studied him more closely. His eyes caught the faded outline on Leland's shoulder. The old fabric held a faint but unmistakable insignia, a red and blue patch, a shape familiar from the history lessons at Paris Island. Reed's breath tightened for a moment. "You served in the 1st Marine Division, didn't you?" Sir Leland simply tugged his coat closed again, his movement slow but firm. "A long time ago," he replied. The answer wasn't boastful yet. It was enough to make Reed's spine straighten. The young Marine swallowed the rising admiration swelling in his chest and snapped to attention out of reflex shaped by the countless days of training ingrained into him. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to call my chain of command." His tone was steady, but the seriousness in it was unmistakable. "I think someone will want to know what just happened here." Leland looked at him for a few seconds. Reed's sincerity didn't irritate him. He nodded again. "Do what you believe is right. No frustration, no expectations. Just the calm acceptance of someone who understood that these small collisions in life were not worth disturbing the quiet he had carried for so many years." Reed stepped back, phone in hand. His voice dropped lower, each sentence crisp and precise without exaggeration. Leland sat still, eyes drifting to the distant sky. He didn't hear every word, nor did he need to. A young Marine was speaking up on his behalf, and that alone eased something inside him. The call lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to stir the afternoon, as if the air itself sensed something beginning to shift. Reed returned, saying nothing more. He simply stood beside Leland, a silent gesture of respect that the store had failed to offer. Leland slipped the badge back into his pocket, his palm still holding the fading chill of the metal. The next wave of the story began forming inside that very silence, ready to push everything toward a turning point, the moment humiliation reached its breaking point. Brent walked straight out of the store with a sneer on his face, as if he had just won some petty argument. He planted himself in front of Leland, his breath thick with arrogance. "I told you to get out of my store," he said loudly enough for everyone in the parking lot to hear. "If you stand here one more minute, I'll call the police. They'll take you in for a mental evaluation while they're at it." Leland looked at him, his expression unchanged. His silence only enraged Brent further. Brent jabbed a finger toward the coat pocket where the silver badge lay hidden beneath the worn fabric. "And that little piece of tin you got there?" he scoffed. "Don't tell me you're proud of that trash. You can buy those online for a couple bucks. Stop pretending you ever fought anywhere." A burst of laughter came from Brent's friends. Leland rose to his feet, slow but steady. That simple movement made Brent even angrier. He shoved Leland hard on the shoulder. The old man staggered, nearly tripping over the edge of a concrete planter. Corporal Reed took a reflexive step forward, but halted when he saw Leland lift a hand slightly, signaling that he didn't want intervention. Then the memory hit. Not a pleasant one. A battlefield dark, muddy, soaked in blood. A young soldier collapsing right in front of him, eyes wide open but seeing nothing. A faint call torn apart by the freezing wind. A red stain spreading across white snow. And right there in the chaos, Leland had removed his own silver star to place it on the young man's chest because the boy had never lived long enough to be awarded one for the courage that saved his comrades. The memory faded, and Leland returned to the present. He looked down at the replacement badge he always carried, not to boast, but to remember the one who never came home. His gaze held a deep restraint, not anger, a sadness so profound that no words could fully reach it. Reed clenched his jaw, his fist tightening until his knuckles turned white. He said nothing, because he knew Leland wouldn't want him to interfere, but his breathing grew heavier, as if his chest could barely contain the indignation rising inside him. "That's enough," Reed said under his breath, voice strained. "You don't have the right to do this." Brent swung toward him and waved a dismissive hand. "And who are you?" "Some comic book hero I'm dealing with the trash standing in front of my store. Thanks for the concern, but I don't need a lecture today." His friends burst into loud, crude laughter behind him, egging him on. The whole parking lot seemed to tilt in his favor, fueled by the noise of his arrogance. Brent kept boasting. "This era belongs to us, not to old men. We're the generation that knows how to use guns, that understands technology, that knows where real power comes from." He waved an expensive accessories box in the air, as if brandishing proof that he knew weapons better than anyone. "People like you, stuck in the past, only know how to tell old stories." Leland lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but because he understood that these words weren't worth answering. A man who had stood face to face with death had no need to argue with someone who had never confronted real fear. And at the exact moment, Brent believed he had fully conquered the situation, his face stretching into a victorious grin, his manufactured bravado swelling even larger. He had no idea that the story was already shifting beneath his feet. Just one more signal, and Brent's prideful words would be drowned out by something approaching, something far greater that anyone in the parking lot could recognize. Reed stepped back toward a corner of the parking lot, pulled out his phone, and reported the incident in a concise, disciplined voice. He described every detail without embellishment. How Brent had insulted Leland, shoved him, mocked his age, and called him senile. On the other end of the line was Sergeant Harris from the base security office. The moment Reed mentioned the name Leland Ward, Harris's tone changed abruptly. He fell silent for several seconds before asking again slowly, as if he needed to confirm he hadn't misheard. "Who did you say?" Reed repeated the name, each syllable clear. No sharp breathing, No rustling of papers, just a weighted stillness, as though the room Harris sat in had suddenly contracted. A chair scraped loudly. Harris shot to his feet. "Keep him there," he ordered, his voice no longer that of a man handling routine calls, but of a Marine who had just heard a name that could not be ignored. "I'll report this immediately." Harris did not follow regular procedure. He didn't call the duty lieutenant. He didn't pass the information through intermediate channels. He went straight to the office of Colonel Morgan, the commanding officer of the entire base. Morgan was a hardened leader experience etched into every bar and ribbon on his uniform. Someone young Marines only needed to see once to know they should stand at attention. When Harris entered and spoke the words, Leland Ward Colonel Morgan stopped writing instantly. No expression. No wasted reaction. He simply turned to his computer, typed in the name, and began reading. 5 pages of service record appeared, most of it blacked out under classified markings. But the unredacted lines were more than enough for Morgan to understand what he was looking at. Chosin Reservoir. Incheon. 2 battlefield wounds. A citation noting extraordinary action under impossible conditions. And a handwritten remark from a general decades ago: "This man was the backbone of those who survived." Morgan closed the screen. He took a slow breath. "Prepare the vehicles," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "And prepare to honor." The order spread instantly. No one asked why. Uniforms were pulled on. Web belts tightened. Young Marines checked buttons, boots, and every detail on their bodies as if preparing for a solemn ceremony. They didn't know who they were going to meet, but they knew they had to arrive with absolute respect. The convoy moved out from the base. No sirens. No flashing lights. No noise. Only the speed and discipline of people carrying the responsibility of protecting their institution's honor. Humvees and command vehicles lined up in a long column, rolling through the base gate and heading straight for the strip mall, where Reed stood guarding a man none of them had yet met. Meanwhile, in the parking lot, Brent continued shouting as if he still controlled the situation. "I told you to get out of here," he barked. "You're bothering my customers." His empty words spilled out again and again, accompanied by the cheers of his friends. He had no idea that those words had already lost every bit of weight. Reed stood beside Leland, his hand curling slightly in reaction to the disrespect he kept hearing. Sir Reed said quietly, "Please don't go anywhere. I've been ordered to keep you here." Leland didn't ask why. He simply placed his hand on his knee and gave a small nod, acknowledging that he understood. A man who had endured great battles no longer cared about petty confrontations. The parking lot trembled for the first time. A deep, steady sound, like the breath of a force drawing closer. Brent didn't notice. Neither did his friends. They paused for a moment, then resumed their laughter. But Reed heard it. He turned his head slowly, recognizing a rhythm no civilian would ever learn to understand. Leland heard it too. He didn't lift his head high, just narrowed his eyes slightly, as though he recognized something he hadn't expected to hear again in many years. And when that sound echoed a second time, stronger, heavier, the air in the parking lot seemed to change. No one spoke, but something was approaching, something none of the loudmouthed spectators could stop. Just a few more beats, and the arrival of those who carried honor on their shoulders would silence everything and bring forth a moment of reverence Brent never imagined would descend upon him. The heavy sound of engines grew closer, clearer, until the entire convoy from the base appeared before everyone's eyes. The military vehicles stopped in a firm semicircle around the parking lot, forming a wall of honor between Leland and the chaos that had been surrounding him. Doors opened, and one by one, Marines stepped out. Uniforms, immaculate footsteps, synchronized faces, set with the solemnity of men who knew exactly whom they had come for. Brent froze. The victorious smirk he'd worn moments ago vanished as if blown away by the wind. His friends stepped back half a pace, faces draining of color, as rows of dress blues and whites appeared before them. Reed straightened his hand, falling naturally to his side, instinct and discipline rising when he saw his senior Marines arrive. Colonel Morgan stepped down from the command vehicle. His posture straight, his rank shining on his shoulders, each step toward Leland carried a quiet reverence. He stopped before the silver-haired man, his polished shoes now at eye level, with the very people who had mocked Leland only minutes earlier. No one dared breathe loudly when Morgan raised his hand in salute, a perfect sharp movement filled with respect. It was not a salute given to an ordinary Marine. It was for someone who had crossed the line between life and death to bring others home. Someone who carried the legacy of an entire generation. "It's an honor, Sergeant Major Leland Ward." Morgan's voice carried across the parking lot, clear and unwavering. It struck the chest of every person standing there. Leland lifted his head slightly. His eyes held no pride, only the calm of deep water, the kind that hides unbroken memories beneath its surface. He returned the salute with a slow, steady motion, as if decades of history had folded into this single moment. Silence washed over the parking lot. Not the awkward silence Brent felt earlier, but one born of genuine reverence. Brent's face turned chalk white. His lips trembled, but no words came out. He looked to his friends for some sort of support, but none of them could meet his gaze. The laughter from earlier now felt humiliating even to them. Morgan turned toward the crowd. "You are standing before a legend," he said, each word sharp and deliberate. "A man who has been in places we know only from history books. A man whose courage our generation can only aspire to." A young Marine in the honor guard glanced at Reed silently, asking whether he had known the identity of the man he'd defended. Reed didn't return the look. His eyes stayed on Leland, his chest swelling with a pride he had never felt before. He whispered just loud enough for himself, "Sir, thank you for letting me stand beside you today." Leland heard him. He didn't turn his head, but his aging shoulders tightened slightly, as though a cold corner of his memory had just been warmed by the respect of the young Marine beside him. Morgan stepped closer to Leland again. "We're here to escort you," he said quietly, his voice shifting from formality to a rare softness for someone of his rank. "What happened today is something none of us can accept." Brent lowered his head even further, as if trying to disappear. He finally understood that his mistake wasn't just disrespect. It was an insult to a legacy he had no right to touch. The honor guard took a step forward, not to intimidate, not to display power, but to show Leland that they stood behind him, a gesture of loyalty, mirroring what he had once done for his brothers in arms long ago. And that salute was only the beginning, because the truth about the man standing before Colonel Morgan was about to silence the parking lot a second time, deeper, heavier, and more sacred than before. Colonel Morgan stood beside Leland, drawing a slow breath, as if choosing each word carefully to match the worth of the man before him. Then he turned to the crowd, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of a solemn declaration. "You should know," he began, "this man was at Incheon, at Chosin, in places where the cold could kill a man faster than bullets." Those standing closest fell silent. Just hearing the name Chosin Reservoir was enough for anyone who understood Marine Corps history to know what that meant. Of 1 to 10. No resupply, no retreat, nothing but willpower and brotherhood, keeping them alive. Morgan continued, each sentence heavier than the last. He fought when everything around him was ice, when the men beside him fell in his arms. He held the defensive line for 3 days straight to keep his unit alive. The words thickened the air in the parking lot, as if the past and present were brushing against each other. In that moment, a memory flashed through Leland's mind. A brief, sharp image. A young Marine lying in the snow, face pale as the frozen earth. The boy had shoved Leland out of a hail of bullets with the last reflex left in his exhausted body. "Go, Sarge." That voice had never left Leland. It had followed him through every year after the war. Morgan caught the shift in Leland's eyes and understood that memory was still alive. He continued. "And the silver badge he's carrying," Morgan said, "is not the original. The original was placed on the chest of the Marine who died saving his life." No one in the crowd moved. A woman pressed her hand over her mouth to hold in a sharp breath. A man blinked rapidly, unable to look away from Leland. And Brent. He stood frozen like a statue. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He finally realized the man he had mocked was someone who had given his youth so that others could live. Someone he could never reach, not with all his loudness, not with any empty pride he carried. A series of crisp commands echoed. The young Marines in the honor guard snapped straight rifles lifted in perfect ceremony. Their movements carried a clear message to them. No power was greater than the silent sacrifice of men like Leland Ward. Reed stood beside Leland, his chest swelling until it felt like it might burst. He silently thanked God that he had stayed, that he had witnessed this moment. Leland, meanwhile, showed no hint of pride. He remained humble. His eyes did not linger on the honor before him, but dropped to the replacement badge in his hand, as if it were a doorway to a memory only he could enter. This was not a moment for him to feel great. It was a moment to remember that he had survived when so many did not. Morgan ended the tribute with a sentence that brought another wave of silence over the lot. "He carries more than a medal," Morgan said. "He carries the memory of those who never came home." No one responded. No one dared break the sacred quiet. Even Brent stayed silent, not because he was afraid, but because for the first time in his life he understood what it meant to feel small before someone truly great. And as the truth settled over everyone, every look, every attitude shifted. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Respect for a life they had almost failed to recognize. From that moment, the story would turn toward another path, where compassion and lessons would be spoken, not by force, but by the voice of a man who had walked through war and carried its memories with grace. Brent stood hunched in front of everyone, his face drained of all color. He tried to lift his eyes, but couldn't bring himself to look directly at Leland. A dry swallow escaped his throat and then caught midway. I'm sorry. He stammered, his voice trembling so badly that the words broke apart. I didn't know. I didn't realize. Leland lifted his hand gently, signaling him to stop. He didn't need to hear more. Not because he wanted to cut Brent off, but because he understood that real remorse didn't need long explanations. He simply wanted the moment to end here without turning it into a reversed humiliation. He looked at Brent, his eyes not angry, just tired. A weariness accumulated over many years. The things you sell, Leland said slowly, are just tools. He raised one hand and lightly touched the pocket where the replacement badge rested. Strength doesn't come from steel. Brent lowered his head even further. He didn't answer, because he knew that any excuse now would only make him smaller. For the first time in his life, he realized that some people didn't need to raise their voices to make others see themselves clearly. Leland watched him a few more seconds, then spoke again, his voice heavy like the echo of a lifetime of war. Respect is something you give first, he said, not something you demand in return. The sentence seemed to slow the air around them. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp like Brent's usual shouting, but it carried the weight of truth. A soft memory flickered behind the old man's eyes, a young Marine lying on a stretcher, face pale, his cold hand still trying to grip Leland's. That Marine would never stand up again. Yet he had used the last of his strength to whisper two words, "Go on," before leaving the world. Leland had never forgotten that gaze. A gaze with no blame, no fear, only absolute trust. Respect was something they gave one another without hesitation. Reed stood beside Leland, listening to every word, as if being taught right there in the parking lot, not from a book or a training room, but from a real man with real wounds and real memories. His throat tightened as though those words were knocking directly against his own sense of honor. He understood that defending Leland's dignity had only been a small part. The greater part was learning how to become a Marine worthy of men like him. Brent did not resist. He did not justify. He did not try to salvage the dignity he had already shredded. He just stood there with slumped shoulders. The silence that spread across the parking lot was no longer the silence of fear or embarrassment. It was a heavy but warm silence, the kind that fills a place when a moral lesson is delivered not through anger, but through compassion and the wisdom of someone who has walked through war. The young Marines in the honor guard held their stance. They didn't intervene. They didn't speak. They simply looked at the silver-haired man before them, as if he were a living standard, a reminder that true dignity cannot be taken away by anyone's arrogance. Morgan stepped forward one pace, but he didn't say anything. He left the space to Leland. Because the words Leland had spoken were not only for Brent, they were for everyone standing there, including the young Marines in the honor guard. Finally, when the silence had said everything it needed to say, Leland turned to Reed. His eyes were no longer heavy. Reed gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that this lesson would stay with him throughout his military career and the rest of his life. That quiet shift would not stop in this parking lot. It would spread further to places where a Marine's honor must always be safeguarded, opening the next chapter of the story, where Leland's legacy would be carved not only in memory, but in action. Just 3 days after the incident, the Quantico base issued an official directive. A short notice appeared on every bulletin board. All military personnel, regardless of rank, were banned from entering Brent's store. No purchases, no visits, no support. A simple order, yet powerful enough to shut the doors of what Brent once boasted was a shooter's paradise. No one argued. No one objected. In the military community, insulting a veteran like Leland was something that could not be forgiven. The directive spread quickly into the civilian community. People who had once frequented the shop began turning away. They read the notice. They saw the video circulating online. They learned that the man thrown out of the store was a former sergeant major who had once stood in the freezing hell of Chosin to protect his fellow Marines. Quiet stories about him spread like a slow but deep wind. A chair, a magazine, or a cleaning kit could never buy trust, and Brent now had none. Just 2 weeks later, the store began to empty out. After a month, Brent was forced to slash prices on all remaining inventory. Marines who had once been regular customers now simply walked past, never stepping inside again. Not out of hatred, but because they understood who truly deserved to stand within the circle of honor. 2.5 months later, Brent stood in the middle of his empty store, staring at shelves that once fed his pride, now coated in dust. No more footsteps. No more customer questions. No more admiring looks. By the 3rd month, Brent signed the papers to sell the store at a devastating loss. He left with only a few boxes of personal belongings and a heavy feeling no one but him could fully understand. He found a simple job at a nearby supermarket, stocking shelves, pushing carts, placing labels. The work wasn't bad, but every day it reminded him how quickly arrogance could be stripped away. One late weekend afternoon, as Brent was arranging cereal boxes, he heard the slow roll of a shopping cart behind him. He turned, and his heart seemed to drop to his stomach. Leland was walking into the aisle, pushing a cart, a little girl beside him, chattering happily about something from school. Leland's eyes were as gentle as the first day Brent saw him, but this time there was no cold sting of insult, only a calmness that comes from a man who'd already forgiven himself, long before forgiving others. Brent bowed his head immediately, pretending to straighten items that were already perfectly aligned. He avoided Leland's gaze as if avoiding a bright light. He knew he wasn't worthy of looking into the eyes of the man he had once insulted with such foolishness. As Leland's cart passed by, Brent stepped aside as though afraid to block his path. Then Leland paused for half a second. He turned, looked at Brent with eyes free of resentment. He said nothing. He simply nodded once. That nod wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't forgetting. It was an acknowledgement that Brent too was a person, and every person has the right to learn again how to show respect. The nod froze Brent in place, his hand still resting on a cereal box. His heartbeat slowed. His breath softened. And the lesson he had avoided for 3 months settled into him more clearly than ever. He didn't apologize. He didn't need to. Leland had already taught him through silence. A heavy yet warm silence, the kind only those who have lost so much in war can understand and offer to another. That night after the store's system closed and Brent stepped out into the parking lot, he looked up at the sky and wondered how someone like Leland could treat him with such humanity. And then he understood silent courage lives on in the hearts of those who know how to respect even when they've paid dearly to learn that lesson. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.